Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and of course for the invitation to speak in this celebrated institution, not only in France but worldwide, the Collège de France. As Vinciane told you, you can ask me questions in French. After the presentation, I can answer in English or in German or in Greek. Unfortunately, not so well in French. I'm sorry about that. Okay. So in ancient Greek society, the concept of the divine could be constructed and communicated through rituals, narratives, such as myths, accounts of curative miracles, descriptions of epiphanies, etc., through attributes, cult epithets, philosophical discourses, ritual performative texts, such as hymns, aretalogies, and prayers, and through hieroi logoi within the framework of mystery cults. The visualization and materialization of the invisible in the form of statues and images on vases and other media, however, played an equally crucial role in the construction of the divine in ancient Greece, a fact that has been often neglected in studies on divine imagery. In addition, what remains puzzling is that the paradox of a culture whose myths punish human beings who dare even glance at the true nature of its gods, yet is obsessed with representing them, has never been addressed in depth. Greeks were not supposed to encounter the true nature, the actual physique of their gods. The famous myth of Semele's death, a result of her seeing Zeus in all his glory, reveals that gods appear to human beings in a rather reduced form. How then are we to explain the countless representations of gods in Greek art? What or which part of a god's nature are they visualizing? How were the gods materialized? Back in 2007, Dita Boschung argued that visual concepts of divine and heroic figures were already defined by the 7th century BCE. While such a claim might hold true for the literary construction of divine figures, particularly in the Homeric and Hesiotic worlds, the impression that emerges from both iconographic evidence and later literary sources such as Pausanias or Philostratos clearly points in the opposite direction to show that the visualization of the divine was more likely a never-ending process of adaptation and reinvention of visual signs and concepts. The physical realization of divine imagery, especially sculpture in the round, as well as the qualities of the various materials used in Greek antiquity, have been recognized as significant parameters for the construction of the divine by several ancient authors. Literary sources praise Phidias for his ability to capture the essence of the gods that he portrayed and consider the sensual style of Praxiteles most appropriate for embodying the erotic qualities of Aphrodite, claiming, for example, that he was able to render the moistness of the goddess's eyes and the sensual fleshiness of the naked body in his much celebrated Cnidian Aphrodite. Certainly, the material, the size, the style of an individual painter or sculptor, and the ontological characterization of a figure through attributes played a role in the process of turning a religious idea into a material object. At a further stage, an architectural setting and the embedment of an image in a concrete ritual context enhance the materialization of the divine. Immanuel Kant's first critique explores how the human sensory capacity construes and gives form to stimuli. My presentation certainly owes much to this idea, but I would like to trace the way back as well and understand how already visualized stimuli, divine images, influence the ways human beings thought and communicated intellectually with the idea of the divine in ancient Greece. Allow me to use the Cnidian Aphrodite as an example. Today, nudity is part of our visual memory of Aphrodite. In the second half of the 4th century BCE, however, a completely naked goddess in the form of a freestanding sculpture was indeed a scandalous iconographic anomaly. This was true even though images of Aphrodite in the nude played at least a minor role in the repertoire of vase painting long before the shocking piece of Praxiteles. The impact of the Cnidian Aphrodite on later visualizations of the same divinity is well known and has been extensively researched. Indeed, the sculpture is the most prominent example of an iconographic anomaly becoming a visually referential canon. The original stimulus, that is, the idea of a goddess in the nude, so prominent in Greek mythology, was transformed by the human sensory capacity into a sculptural image, that is, the Cnidian Aphrodite, which became a new stimulus that changed the iconography of the goddess for centuries to come. A less known, or at least less used case that exemplifies the transformation of a visual innovation into a canonical, even ontological feature of a Greek divinity's physique is Athena's aegis. Until the later 6th century BCE, figures of Athena can be presented with or without an aegis. Probably shortly after the creation of the so-called endoios Athena, the aegis started becoming a visual element without which a representation of the goddess was deemed exceptional. By the time the famous relief of the so-called mourning Athena found its way to the Athenian Acropolis around 460 BCE, an Athena without an aegis was considered indeed an anomaly. It is noteworthy that Pausanias occasionally expresses his puzzlement while describing statues of Athena without an aegis. A visual innovation of the mid-6th century gradually became the materialized symbol of the goddess's invincibility. Several parameters played an important role in the construction of the divine through visual media and primarily sculpture in the round. I have to confess that I focused on sculpture and not on vases because of Hélène. In addition to external features such as attributes, materials, or dimensions, the notion of age, ancientness of divine imagery was of great significance, so that often images of gods acquired an intentional antiquarian appearance that has been interpreted by scholars, in my view wrongly, almost exclusively as a sign of religious conservatism. The presentation of statues of divinities outside the context of ritual practice, as when, for example, they are set before ornamental lakes, effectively illuminated or placed behind barriers in temples, shaped ancient Greek understanding of divine beings as well, since the display of a divine statue was primarily a further way to enhance its potential to inspire awe to the viewer through purely material means. In most studies discussing the phenomenon of Greek divine imagery, anthropomorphism is addressed, but in a highly matter-of-fact way. Why exactly the Greeks decided to construct their gods as anthropomorphic beings is a question that is rarely asked. Even more important, it seems to me, is the cultural context in which such a decision was made. Surrounded by cultures with a much longer tradition of visualizing the divine or the demonic, but ones that chose to emphasize the otherness of their gods by giving them non-humanoid forms, for example, the deities associated with nature and natural phenomena in the Near East, or the countless hybrid divinities of the Egyptian pantheon, the Greeks, despite being deeply influenced by these cultures, opted for a variant that emphasized their gods' human-like nature. Even without looking at actual representations of the divine in Greece, and the earliest of these cannot be dated before the late geometric period, we get the distinct impression from even a superficial reading of the Homeric poems that Greek gods would not only end up looking, but also acting like human beings. Yet instead of attempting to understand Greek anthropomorphism, scholarship has focused on forms of visualization that at first sight appear more exotic, as exemplified by two relatively recent publications focusing on hybrid forms and aniconism, respectively. I am not implying here that studies of the other Greek types of visualization of the divine are futile. Quite the contrary. I'm suggesting that we cannot truly comprehend the exceptions, aniconism, visual hybridization, to the rule until we see them as the products of a conscious decision to oppose the canon of anthropomorphism, the study of which still remains, in my view, a desideratum. Greek anthropomorphism has to be placed in the cultural context of archaic Greece, a time when philosophy, especially in Ionia, showed a strong interest in human issues. In the Homeric poems, the human behavior of the Greek gods, often seen as anticipating the visualization of the divine in human forms, should be downplayed. The mythological narratives associated with Egyptian gods, for example, the story revolving around Osiris's murder and mutilation, quite often represent these Egyptian gods with similar human behavioral flaws. But this did not lead to their anthropomorphic depiction. It was probably philosophy, particularly natural philosophy, that played a paramount role in the establishment of the visual humanization of Greek gods. And philosophy was the intellectual field that set Greeks so far apart from their neighbors. Do not get me wrong, I do not suggest that natural philosophy was the actual initiator of anthropomorphic divine imagery, but rather that it helped push Greek thought down a very specific path at a time when the Greeks were still experimenting with various means and forms of visualizing and materializing the divine. I do not make use of the term anthropomorphic at face value, however. The formal anthropomorphism did not automatically imply a complete humanization of the divine entities as forms. I will return to this critical appreciation of Greek anthropomorphism later. If human forms are used for the depiction of the divine, how can they be recognized as visually different from depictions of common mortals? It is a well-known fact that archaic sculpture is notorious for its visual ambivalence, which is often deemed by scholars a fairly crude predecessor to the more advanced visual specificity of the classical and subsequent periods. In my view, in the early 5th century BCE, or perhaps even in the late 6th, radical anthropomorphism that led to barely distinguishable images of divine and human beings was seen as increasingly problematic, and thus visual specificity was employed as a means of counteracting this situation. It is striking how an early portrait such as that of Themistocles bears surprisingly individualized features that seem specific. Conversely, the faces of divine beings remain puzzlingly uninvolved throughout antiquity, although the postures, attributes, and visualized narratives of depicted gods grow increasingly specific, their faces rarely abandon what I would like to call a visual air of nonchalance. Though anthropomorphic, divine faces are, in my view, the primary visual means for differentiating between the divine. Though anthropomorphic, divine faces are, in my view, the primary visual means for differentiating between the divine and the human. They never cease to express an absolute lack of involvement in human affairs. I refer explicitly to their depictions, even though in literature they remain insufferably flawed. In terms of bodily forms, the early 3rd century initiated a more intense way of differentiating between gods and human beings, namely by showing old men and women as such, as old men and women, while letting so-called father or mother divine figures keep their youthful bodies and their flawless faces. A presentation that deals with the materiality of divine imagery cannot but refer to the actual materials used for the production of statuary. Influenced by the abundance of preserved Roman copies of Greek originals, scholars have emphasized the importance of stone and particularly marble for the creation of divine images, Even a quick look, however, at the works of authors such as Pausanias and Pliny reveals that actually the contrary was the case. Nevertheless, one can safely assume that bronze and stone, usually marble, were the most popular materials, which is hardly surprising as these are the two most frequently used materials by Greek sculptors in general. In the past, scholars assumed that the archaic period had been a time primarily of stone. The classical and late classical period, a time of bronze, and the Hellenistic period, one that did not seem to favor one over the other material. Although I agree with this assessment for the time from around the 5th century onwards, I disagree with its position on the archaic period. First, most literary sources focus on post-archaic imagery, and second, archaeological evidence such as the 7th century bronze korai from Olympia or the so-called Apolline Triad from Dryros suggests that bronze was used more broadly in the archaic period than scholarship has thus far assumed. Although it is difficult to associate these two materials exclusively with divine imagery, the same does not hold true for ivory and gold, which were used for the creation of divine images for many centuries. How pregnant with meaning the semantics of these two materials were is demonstrated by the well-known fact that the statues of the Macedonian house, royal house, that were placed in the Philippeion in Olympia were chryselephantine. Thus, the very materiality of the images elevated the status of the depicted mortals to the sphere of the divine. It comes as no surprise that gold and ivory were often used for creating images of the godlike members of Hellenistic ruling houses. Our sources also refer, albeit rarely, to divine images of silver, dark stone variations, and even gypsum. Ever since Alice Donahue's work on Xoana, wooden images have played an important role in scholarly debates about the materiality of the divine image. Thanks to literary sources, primarily Pausanias, wooden images have long been considered ancient. Donahue, however, has successfully deconstructed the hypothesis that the term xoanon refers to exceedingly old divine images. Although she is most probably right when it comes to the term, I suggest that there is something true in Pausanias' association of wood with ancientness. Wood may be one of the oldest, if not the oldest, material to be used for sculpture, as is shown by preserved evidence in Egypt. Its physical properties, contrary to those of other materials, such as stone or bronze, do not allow it to be reused as building material in the case of stone or minted into coins in the case of bronze. Thus, by the time Pausanias visited Greece, and perhaps even long before the 2nd century CE, wooden statues were indeed among the oldest preserved images of their kind. Equally interesting is also the question as to why wood was not more extensively used as a material from the classical period on. I suspect that by the 5th century BCE, wood was too closely associated with older images, ones that were not made by human hand or whose origins were lost in a mythical past. The acquired and elevated semantics of wood, which was associated not only with divine status, but also with venerable age, hampered probably its more extensive use. It is significant that none among the celebrated sculptors of the 5th and 4th centuries was ever associated with divine images made of wood. Considering the easiness with which one can shape this material into anything one wishes, its absence from the repertoire of famous artists is at least puzzling. Based on the evidence delivered by Pausanias and with the help of an almost complete database that I have been working on for a couple of years, as you can see here, the information from book 10th is missing from the numbers. About divine images in the books of this author, it does seem that stone is the most popular material, followed by bronze and wood. Stone, if we put together undefined stone and marble. Interestingly, the wooden images are almost always those which Pausanias, at least, considers old, or whose creators remain unknown or not interesting. There has been a trend for years, actually, in art historical, particularly German scholarship, to place the modes of display of Greek divine images within the frame of theatricality, thus emphasizing their artistic over their religious aspects. Especially with respect to Hellenistic divine imagery, scholars such as Hans Ulrich Kain have claimed that by this point in time, Hellenistic, statues of deities located in temples were considered more or less objects of art and were displayed in a museum-like setting. One cannot deny that the placement of the Athena Parthenos, already in the classical period, within the spatial context of the Parthenon did enhance the powerful presentation of the image as there it could be seen from all sides. In fact, the addition of a double-storied row of columns behind the statue, as well as rows on its sides, created together a mise-en-scène that can only be termed theatrical. Furthermore, the reflection of the statue on the shallow pool right before it must have enhanced not only the lustrous quality of the precious materials of the image, but also its size, which would have made it appear nearly double its height to anyone entering the Parthenon. An encounter with the double Athena was truly an epiphanic moment for any worshipper approaching the goddess. Moreover, a barrier before the pool created a boundary that physically and, more importantly, psychologically separated the small human from the gigantic goddess. The statues inside the temple of Lycosoura in Arcadia were visually enhanced in an architecturally less spectacular but no less suggestive way. Besides the fact that they were perceived as colossal due to the relatively small size of the temple, a mirror mounted on the wall next to the entrance to the building created a most fascinating illusion. Thanks to it, the worshipper would have seen himself barely or not at all, but the statues on their throne all the more clearly. Thus, the human element would have disappeared in the presence of the god. In Olympia and Ephesus, Zeus and Artemis respectively must have appeared to those entering the temple as dei ex machina. Pausanias refers to monumental curtains in the case of Olympia made of Phoenician purple and adorned with Assyrian weaving, an offering of either Antiochus III or Antiochus IV, behind which the statues were hidden and presented to the worshippers at the right moment in a truly theatrical way. Just like the dichotomy between cult statue and votive offering, the strict differentiation between object of art and object of worship is, in my view, a modern scholarly construct. Spatial elements within temples, such as barriers, pools, mirrors, table of offerings, curtains, and so on and so forth, enhance the awe-inspiring qualities of divine imagery. They did not transform them into actual objects of art. Their flawlessness and beauty set against an impressive background were simply two of these awe-inspiring material qualities. Scholars outside the study of the ancient world, or worlds, often understand Greek art within the frame of so-called artistic genius, that creates art for the sake of the art. On the contrary, and despite several rather late anecdotes, Greek sculptors created statues of gods for highly specific cultural and spatial contexts. The military iconography of Apollo Amyklaios, for example, cannot be seen outside the context of Spartan society. The chryselephantine statue of Asclepios in Epidauros, a conscious imitation of the image of Zeus in Olympia, cannot be understood without the knowledge that the sanctuary was aspiring to a more officially acknowledged pan-Hellenic status. Cities or citizen bodies, influenced occasionally by powerful political figures such as Pericles in Athens, were in most cases the patrons of divine images that functioned as the primary cult statues of temples. The case of Xenophon, who as a single individual decided to have a statue imitating the image of Artemis Ephesia in the temple he dedicated to the goddess on his private estates in Skylous, is the exception to the rule and does not represent ancient Greek realities. There are, of course, late anecdotes to emphasize the personal involvement of the artist in the decision-making process regarding the exact appearance of a cult image, the most famous, again, being that of Praxiteles and his revolutionary Cnidia. But in most cases, we have to imagine the process as a dialectic one between patron and artist, with the patron holding the power over the final decision, a very similar process to what we know, actually, about the artistic production during the Renaissance. Historical studies on divine imagery have extensively analyzed various rituals or ritual acts, for example, washing, dressing, or adorning the statue, as well as kneeling or praying before a divine image, that involved a direct interaction between human beings and sculptural depictions of gods. Yet one important form of interaction has thus far found little attention: the visual communication with the material form of the divine. I'm not referring here to epiphanic encounters between gods and mortals, but rather to the actual act of viewing the divine statue in all its materiality as part of a ritual sequence in which viewing means participating. In a culture such as that of the Greeks, which was not particularly interested in exploring the invisibility of God, the visual experience of the material manifestations of divine entities was indeed crucial. Inscriptions, for example, emphasize the importance of visible divine images that were supposed to occupy the visually most prominent parts of specific spaces. What appears at first sight as a simple form of honor towards a god can be seen within a broader context as providing unhindered possibilities for visual communication to worshippers. In this context, one should also place what I call the hierarchy of multiple images. By the late classical period, for example, any visitor to the Acropolis of Athens or participant in the Panathenaic procession would have encountered a multitude of images of Athena populating a rather confined space. From the figures of Athena on the Nike parapet to the Athena Hygieia next to the monumental gates, the Athena Lemnia, the Athena Promachos, the Athena Polias, from the images of Athena on the northern and eastern metopes, to both pediments and the eastern part of the Ionic frieze of the Parthenon and the celebrated Athena Parthenos, a visitor would have communicated with a series of images of Athena that conveyed interrelated but slightly different messages about the nature of the goddess venerated on the Athenian Acropolis. In my view, there was an almost hierarchical and historically developed structure behind the Athena images that led the viewer along the Acropolis, with the image of Athena Polias as the apogee of this almost never-ending encounter with material manifestations of the very same goddess. Similar meetings between divine image and viewer, in which multiplication and repetition enhance the visitor's experience, can be reconstructed in the case of other sanctuaries such as Olympia, Delphi, and Delos. Allow me to focus now a bit more intensively on an issue that has puzzled me, at least, for quite some time: the size of a statue as a paramount element in constructing the material presence of a divine being. In Jus Tragödus, probably Lucian's most often discussed work, the Alarmed Council of the Gods deliberates over the problematic lack of respect among men towards them. Before the council even begins, Zeus orders Hermes to assign places to the gods as they arrive. The passage describing the process is essentially a hierarchical evaluation of materials used for the creation of divine images in Greek antiquity, as the gods are assigned places based on the material of which their most celebrated statue had been created. explicitly mentioned are Praxiteles' marble Aphrodite and Lysippos' bronze figures of Poseidon, Heracles, and Dionysus. Then Helios introduces the question of size into the debate and demands to be seated at the front due to the size of the bronze image that the Rhodians had created in his honor. His reasoning, however, is based not on the dimensions of his statue, but on its value. Had the Rhodians not wished to create a monstrous, Lucian's words, and enormous statue of bronze, they could have created 16 gods of gold at the same expense, he argues, Helios. Thus, it is not size that seems to matter, but rather the value and quantity of the material used. Ultimately, Helios is assigned a seat at the very back, for he, or rather his statue, is too big to occupy a place at the front of the divine assembly. Within a few sentences, Lucian, known for his skepticism towards traditional Greek religious beliefs, subtly but definitively dismisses a question that had troubled Greeks at least since the time of Homer, namely, how big are the gods? If there is a connection between a god and his or her image, what size should the statue be? From Homer's time on, the gods were imagined as larger-than-life entities and their height equated with beauty. When comparing Penelope to Calypso, for example, Odysseus chooses to emphasize the difference in size between his mortal wife and the immortal and ageless goddess. By the same token, large stature transforms human beings into godlike creatures admired by their peers. Well known is the story of Pisistratos' return to Athens, accompanied by a woman from Paeania who impersonated Athena. According to Herodotus, this woman called Phia, 3 fingers short of 6 feet 4 inches in height, so she was almost 190, and otherwise too well formed, was given armor, placed in a chariot, and made to stand next to Pisistratos while heralds announced to the Athenian people that Athena herself was bringing him back to the city. What is important is that the historian is quite specific about the impressive size of Phia, while the rest of the description of her incredible beauty remains painfully vague. Conversely, when gods wish to enhance the physical appearance of their favorite human beings, they make them appear taller and thus more godlike. On a more philosophical level, it is primarily Aristotle who seems to be interested in the interrelationship between size and beauty, emphasizing repeatedly that physical beauty lies in large stature. The philosopher is willing to recognize a certain degree of symmetry in what he calls small people, zmikroi, but refuses to identify them as beautiful, kaloi. Like Homer or Herodotus, however, Aristotle does not offer any precise definition of large, nor does he specify at which point the size boundary between a human and a divine being is actually crossed. Apparently, ancient authors never felt comfortable enough to provide precise measurements when dealing with the question, how big are actually our gods? The reports are always comparative. The gods are simply larger than humans. Indeed, exceptional in this respect is the hyperbolic description of Ares' fallen body in the Iliad, in the passage where the poet describes how the god, I cite Homer, stretched over 7 roods in his fall after Athena struck him on the battlefield. So almost an entire football place. Although modern scholarship has only occasionally addressed the issue of the size of divine, but also in general, images in Greek and Roman antiquity, the discourse focuses primarily on colossal dimensions. While some art historians have been inclined to view colossality as an important parameter for identifying an ancient statue as a masterpiece, Historians of religion have addressed it as a means to visually construct the sacred. A problem that has repeatedly drawn the attention of researchers is the exact meaning and use of the term kolossos, the ancient term kolossos, which in our sources is not associated exclusively with images of a colossal size. Ultimately, any attempt to define colossality in absolute terms on the basis of surviving literary or material evidence is a futile intellectual exercise. The impact of a statue's size has to be understood in relation to its surroundings. At 12.5 meters, including the base, the Athena Parthenos can certainly be called colossal, yet it is enclosed on three sides by even taller, double-storied colonnades. On the other hand, though smaller than the Chryselephantine statue in the Parthenon, the 9-meter-tall archaic marble statue of Apollo on Delos stands in the open and towers over the adjacent oikos of the Naxians. The different architectural settings of the two statues set their absolute dimensions in perspective and accordingly modify the ways in which viewers would have perceived them. Furthermore, even far smaller statues can create the illusion of colossality if they are placed against a more modest architectural backdrop. The Hellenistic cult group created by Damophon, I keep using this image, as you can imagine, it's one of my favorites. The Hellenistic cult group created by Damophon for the temple of Despoina at Lycosura was, along with its base, probably around 5.9 meters, that is, less than half the size of the Athena Parthenos. Nevertheless, the temple's ceiling was barely higher than the group, so that the overall impression must have been of a statuary group that hardly fit inside the temple. Although scholarship tends to focus primarily on colossal images of the classical period, one can safely claim that monumental images were produced continuously from the 7th century BCE to the end of antiquity. If any single Greek sculptor were to be intrinsically connected to divine images of colossal proportions, it would have to be Phidias. Ancient literary sources praise him as the one who could capture best the essence of the invisible divine entity and transform it into a physical presence. His most famous statue was, of course, the Chryselephantine statue of Zeus created for his sanctuary at Olympia. The most detailed and lengthy description of the statue appears in Pausanias' account. The ancient traveler does not mention the size of the statue, however, and according to his own admission, he did this on purpose. I know, he writes, that the height and breadth of the Olympic Zeus have been measured and recorded, but I shall not praise those who made the measurements, for even their records fall far short of the impression made by a sight of the image. His comment is significant because it offers invaluable insight into the importance of the viewer's perception of any given statue. Obviously, Pausanias felt that a simple list of numbers could not capture the impact of the actual statue on anyone entering the temple, and decided to leave this to his reader's imagination after offering a description that is 9 paragraphs long, all the more striking as his account of the Athena Parthenos is only 1/3 that length. A fragmentary poem by the Hellenistic poet Callimachos has helped scholars determine that the statue must have been between 12 and 12.5 meters in height without its base, which would have added at least 1 more meter to its overall size. On the other hand, size is one of the few things that Strabo comments on with reference to the Chryselephantine Zeus, and he does so in negative terms, disconcerted by the lack of symmetry and balance between the statue and its architectural setting. He writes, "It was made of ivory, and it was so large that although the temple was very big, the artist is thought to have missed the proper symmetry, for he showed Zeus seated but almost touching the roof with his head, thus making the impression that if Zeus arose and stood erect, he would unroof his own temple. According to Pausanias, the height of the Olympian temple was roughly 20 meters, meaning that to someone looking up towards the head of the statue, the distance between the head and the roofing system would have appeared even shorter. One cannot help but agree with the ancient author, for a comparison between reconstructions of the Athena Parthenos in her temple and Zeus Olympios in his reveals that the latter, Zeus Olympios, appeared almost squeezed, pressed inside the building, while the former, the Athena Parthenos, enjoyed indeed an almost museum-like architectural setting in the Parthenon. The Phidian statue in that temple was nearly as famous in its time. Although there are far fewer literary sources referring to it than to Zeus in Olympia, several inscriptions contemporaneous with its creation offer invaluable information on the working process and costliness of the chryselephantine image. Pausanias, who does not mention the temple's frieze, over which all scholars obsess, nevertheless dedicates 3 paragraphs to a fairly detailed description of the work. As in his account of the Olympian Zeus, so here he does not offer any explicit information on the statue's dimensions, though in this case he does not even bother to mention whether or not it was large. It is Pliny who gives the height of the statue, roughly 11.5 meters without the base, which was approximately 1 meter tall. It is surprising that though the statue of Athena Parthenos was to remain the tallest in Athens until the creation of the chryselephantine Zeus Olympios under Hadrian, it was the bronze statue of Athena Promachos, which was 3.5 meters shorter, that Demosthenes addressed as the big one, he megale. According to Pausanias, this very statue was large enough so that those approaching Athens from Sunion by ship could see the point of the spear of this Athena and the crest of her helmet. In terms of visibility, the Athena Promachos, perched in the open and on top of the Acropolis, was a crucial point of reference. Based on a passage in Nikitas Choniates' work and the remains of the image's base on the Acropolis, the height of the statue has been approximated at 7.5 meters, or 9 meters with the inclusion of its base. As Kenneth Lapatin has rightly emphasized, these 2 Phidian chryselephantine statues had truly an immense impact on the creation of similarly precious images in the late 5th and 4th centuries BCE. One immediate reaction to their erection was probably the commission for a colossal chryselephantine image for the sanctuary of Hera in the Argive plain, granted to Polykleitos, who most likely did not live to see his work completed. The exact size of the statue remains unknown, though Pausanias does address it as large, agalma megetei mega. A comment made by Strabo strongly suggests that the statue of Hera was smaller than the images in Athens and Olympia. I cite him, made by Polykleitos, in execution the most beautiful in the world, but in costliness and size inferior to those by Phidias. Obviously, Strabo, critical of Phidias's work in Olympia, rates Polykleitos' artistry more highly than that of his Athenian contemporary. Although Phidias is repeatedly praised for his ability to depict the divine, an epigram from the 1st century BCE, attributed to Parmenion from Macedonia, reveals a far closer connection between Polykleitos and the statue of the goddess that he was portraying. I cite the epigram. Polykleitos the Argive, who alone saw Hera with his eyes and molded her size as he saw it, revealed her beauty to mortals as far as was permissible. But the unknown forms under the garment we reserve for Zeus. Polykleitos saw the goddess, survived the experience, and more importantly, depicted her in her proper size. This is the only time, as far as I know, in ancient Greek literature that an artist is praised for materializing a divinity according to his or her correct dimensions. The largest, and perhaps for this reason most famous colossal statue of Greek antiquity, was the indeed very short-lived image of Helios, which Ares created for the Rhodians soon after their victory over Antigonos I Monophthalmos and his son Demetrios I Poliorcetes in 304 BCE. According to Pliny, the statue was 32.36 meters tall and was destroyed by an earthquake only 66 years after its creation, though, according to Pliny, even lying on the ground, it was a marvel. Strabo too notes that the statue originally stood at 32.36 meters, thus corroborating Pliny's account, or Pliny corroborating Strabo. In late classical and Hellenistic Rhodes, images of colossal dimensions seem to have been particularly popular. Pliny refers to 100 other colossal statues in the same city, and more specifically adds that there were 5 colossal statues of gods made by Bryaxis. Colossal or monumental dimensions remain a primary means of rendering the divine in material terms throughout antiquity. In view of ancient religious beliefs, this observation comes as no surprise, for though the exact dimensions of the gods were unknown, they were definitely seen as entities that defied anything that could even remotely be considered life-sized. As hyperbolic as it may sound, the Homeric description that I referred to in the past of the fallen body of Ares as covering several thousand square meters on the battlefield of Troy demonstrates that there were no boundaries to human imagination when assigning size to the gods. Colossal images must thus have appeared as the most appropriate way of capturing this feature of a god's defined physique. The countless votive reliefs that depicted worshippers approaching their gods or statues attest to this deeply felt otherness of the gods. There is always a significant difference in size between those in the human sphere and the divine being or its representation. If one accepts the idea that monumental dimensions best express the true nature of divine beings, at least in terms of their size, then one is immediately confronted with a paradox. How does one explain the countless under-life-sized images of gods? Even if smaller figurines can be seen as devotional objects that enhanced worship by multiplying the divine ad infinitum, there are still a significant number of under-life-sized figures that did function as cult images in various sanctuaries and thus were the primary point of visual reference for those visiting them. The 3 early archaic spherellata discovered in the Temple of Apollo in Dryros and securely identified as cult images serve as a perfect example of such items. Their size is by no means impressive. The male figure, identified as Apollo, has a preserved height of roughly 80 centimeters, while the 2 female figurines, identified as Leto and Artemis, now stand at 40 and 45 centimeters respectively. Another statue of Apollo dating to the second half of the 6th century BCE, which was found inside a Doric temple in Metropolis, an ancient city in southwestern Thessaly, is another case in point. With its low plinth, the image measures only 80.2 centimeters, although the high pedestal at the center of the temple, on which the figure originally stood, certainly added to its overall impression. Although not preserved, small cult images, usually but not exclusively made of wood, we have also a number of such images made of ivory, captured the imagination of ancient authors for centuries. We are thus rather well informed about their appearance and the magical powers frequently attributed to them. Stories about their extraordinary age and superhuman abilities pervade the narratives associated with them. Nonetheless, more often than not, it is their alleged origin in the sky that transforms these images, usually very simple in their visual language, into God-sent acheiropoieta, completely and utterly otherworldly figures far from the human sphere. The list of such figures is fairly long and includes some of the most celebrated cult images of the ancient Greek world: the hero of Samos, the original cult statue in the Argive Heraion, and the image of Athena Polias in Athens, to name only three. These old, venerated, wooden images were not only small, but also easily portable, and ones that could thus participate in the rituals performed in their honor. The old wooden image of Artemis Orthia in Sparta, allegedly the one brought to Greece by Iphigenia, not only participated as the primary audience in the well-known ritual flagellation of youths, but was also itself affected by whether or not its performance was correct. The actually easy-to-bear image, xoano ephoron, held by the priestess, became heavier if it felt, the image felt, that one of the youths had been spared the lash on account of his beauty or nobility. Aware of this paradoxical situation of small images conveying the unimaginable magnitude of the Greek gods, Walter Verdenius was probably the first, and so far the only, scholar who attempted to explain this discrepancy. In his view, small images could not replicate in terms of size the physical greatness of the gods, but they contained an inexplicable greatness of mind, a megalopsychia that could be deemed an equivalent to the physical, material size of a large statue. Neither the necessity of the cult figure to participate in ritual activities, nor Verdenius's embodiment of megalopsychia in small images can adequately explain the popularity of under-life-size divine images in various cults. A nearly obvious pre-assumption for the understanding of both over and under life-size divine imagery is that no physical, material presence can fully embody the totality of a divine being. Monumental images focused on the gods' superhuman size, which was intrinsically associated with their power and omnipresence. Conversely, smaller statues could embody the physical involvement of gods in human affairs through their participation in rituals, including their public display in processions and sacrifices. Their often described magical powers strengthened the impression of the gods' almighty powers in a way that differed from monumental images, which communicated the same sense of divine absolute power to the worshippers simply through their material presence. In my view, however, there is a critical aspect in which small and large divine images converge and become material vessels of the same immaterial message. Given that the average male height in ancient Greece was between 166 and 170 meters, and that of an average woman between 156 and 159 meters, even a statue like Nicandre's Artemis, shown here at 175 meters, possessed a priori god-like physical, material qualities. Despite their formal anthropomorphism, statues of gods from the Delian Artemis to the Rhodian Helios were anything but anthropomorphic in terms of size. This is where small divine images meet their larger counterparts. Their size is not human, is not anthropomorphic. Through their size, small and large divine images equally emphasize the fundamental otherness of the gods that they are meant to manifest in physical form. It thus comes as no surprise that one rarely, if ever, encounters truly life-sized images of gods in ancient Greece. Around or shortly after 1437, Jan van Eyck created his Madonna in the church, currently in the Gemäldegalerie in Berlin. On a wooden panel of no more than 31 by 14 centimeters, the artist conveys an immediate sense of colossality. With her elaborate crown, Virgin Mary holding the infant Christ rises almost to the height of the triforium. The realities of the human size of the Virgin and the monumentality of the interior of the medieval cathedral become irrelevant. Size has been transformed into an attribute of the Virgin, who is no longer the human mother of Jesus, but the divine Queen of Heaven. Interestingly, one can detect in the background and placed within a niche another image of the Virgin holding the infant Christ, this time in stone, behind the real one. The minuscule statue, however, pales into insignificance compared to the monumentality of the true Virgin. For the classically trained art historian, the comparison of this painting with the sculpture of the Athena Parthenos in its architectural frame is apparent. The difference, however, is that in Van Eyck's painting, colossality is reserved to the true divine figure, while the ancient Greek image attempts, at least, to replicate with material means this aspect of the divine nature. At the end of this presentation, I would like to very briefly address the question as to what the Greeks saw when they encountered material manifestations of their gods. Did they see their gods, or simply objectified, materialized images of their gods? This issue is intrinsically bound to the question as to whether or not Greek gods inhabited their statues, and thus whether or not the agency of the statue should be literally equated with the agency of the divinity it represented. In other words, did the Greeks draw a line between signifier and signified, or did they, and let me use the Saussurean model correctly, consider these two elements as indivisible parts of the same entity, the sign? In his habilitation thesis, Peter Eich vehemently repudiated the idea that gods inhabited their statues and argued that Greeks, because they were logical and intelligent, no, that's truly his argument, always consciously perceived the divine entity as being something separate from its depiction. The concrete material cannot be equal to the abstract idea. In a similar way, Millet Geifman attempted to explain aniconic images as signifiers of divine potency, which in her view should not be considered actual representations of divine beings. I would like to argue in the exact opposite direction and reconstruct a particularly strong link between the agency of the god and the agency of his image in all its recognizable materiality. An unusual scene on an early classical oinokoe in New York seems at first sight simply to visualize a prayer scene. An older, bearded man with a walking stick stands behind a column on top of which stands a statue of Athena. He raises his right hand and points with his forefinger towards the statue. His mouth is open. The unexpected element in the scene is the fact that the statue seems to turn its head towards the praying man. This is, to me at least, a clear indication of a living image inhabited by the deity at the moment that it is being addressed by a worshipper. The painter of the Oinokoe, stylistically not even a good one, is here commenting on the debate over the identification of images with the deities they were meant to represent. Clearly, he at least believed that occasionally image and deity were one and the same. The power of the materialized image of a god cannot be separated from his or her power as a divine entity. As Friedrich Schiller put it in his famous Mary Stuart, the attractiveness and suggestive potential of divine imagery could even make someone change his own beliefs, religious beliefs, thanks to the power of the image and not to the power of the word. Thank you very much.
I will comment in English. So, thank you so much. It was really inspiring for me because you put on the table the problem of the representation and power. And at the end, it was really interesting because it's one of my main problems when I'm studying statues and images. Did the Greek consider that they were the god as such? And I confess that for me, not because they are logical or rational, but because this is something in stone, they are completely conscious of the materiality, and you refer to this. But it's a place where potentially the God can manifest itself.
Yes.
Would you agree with this?
Yes. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah.
So it's not complete the identity between the God and the statue. So I agree with H. The statue is not the God as such, but it can be the place where the God manifests itself.
Peter Eich does not accept even that.
Okay.
That the statue could be seen, at least for a brief period of time,
yes.
Yeah, as being truly inhabited by the God and acting on behalf of the God. So for him, these were always separate entities, which means when the god Dionysus is, I think, one of his favorite examples. When Dionysus, the statue of Dionysus, is participating in a procession, for anyone looking at that, cognitively they know this is not Dionysus, this is just an image. Yeah? Okay. And I'm arguing against that. Yeah? So there are, in another context, of course, it's also a completely different religious system. It's a later source. The famous story about the Virgin Mary icon from Vlachernai in Constantinople. Yeah, that there was a ritual, I think every Friday or every Saturday, I don't remember. And during that ritual, one could observe how Virgin Mary came, inhabited the icon, and the face or the head of Virgin Mary would move. Yeah? There you see again these kind of, the Virgin Mary, the image is not, the Virgin Mary. We are not talking about a complete similitude. What we are talking about is that there is, with the power of the ritual, these moments when the image actually becomes the god, or the goddess, and then it goes back to being an object, if you like.
Completely agree with this. Yes, it's really a question of power and capturing the presence and the power of the gods by the ritual. Yeah. And the ritual is
but the vessel remains. Yes, of course. The sculptures. Usually, we're talking about sculptures. Yeah.